The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty road that led to the old farmhouse. It had been 10 long years since Emma had last walked this path, 10 years of silence, 10 years of wondering if her family still remembered her. She adjusted the frayed strap of her worn satchel, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of her patched dress. The wind carried the scent of hay and earth, a familiar smell that should have brought comfort. But today, it only made her heart ache. She had left as a hopeful girl, eager to find work in the city, promising to send money back home. But life had not been kind. The jobs were few, the pay was little, and the loneliness was heavy. Still, she had scraped together every coin she could, sending what little she had back whenever possible. She had dreamed of the day she would return, imagining her mother's warm embrace, her father's proud smile, her siblings rushing to greet her. But as she stepped onto the family's land, the laughter and chatter from the house did not stop. No one noticed her standing at the edge of the yard. The tables were piled high with food, roasted meats, fresh bread, pies glistening with syrup, all things she had gone without for so long. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and walked forward. Her younger brother, Thomas, was the first to see her. His smile faltered, his eyes flickering over her faded dress and scuffed shoes. Then, slowly, the others turned. Her mother's face went still. Her father's brows furrowed. The cousins she had played with as a child whispered behind their hands. The air grew thick, like the moment before a storm. Emma, her mother finally said, her voice cool. "You came back?" The words stung, but she forced a smile. "Yes, Mama. I wanted to see you all." Her father cleared his throat, not meeting her eyes.
"Well,
"There's food if you're hungry." No hug. No welcome. Just the unspoken words hanging in the air. "You don't belong here." She sat at the far end of the table, picking at a piece of bread while the others talked loudly over her. Stories were shared, new horses bought, a barn rebuilt, Thomas's engagement to a wealthy farmer's daughter. No one asked about her life. No one seemed to care. Then her sister, Martha, leaned over with a false smile. "So, Emma, did you ever marry? Or find any real work?" The table went quiet. Emma's face burned. "I worked hard," she said softly. "I sent money when I could." Martha smirked.
"Oh, that."
"We barely noticed." A ripple of laughter followed. Emma's hands trembled in her lap. She had walked for days to get here, had saved for months just to afford the journey. And this was her welcome? Her father stood suddenly, his chair scraping the ground. "Emma, we have guests arriving soon. Maybe it's best if you don't stay long." The dismissal was clear. She stood, her legs unsteady, and nodded. "I understand." No one walked her to the door. No one called after her. As she stepped back onto the road, the sun now sinking behind the hills, she let the tears fall. She had nothing. No home. No family. Just the clothes on her back and the weight of their rejection pressing down on her chest. But then, as the wind brushed against her cheeks, she whispered a prayer. "God, if they won't take me in, show me where I belong." And with that, she walked away, leaving the laughter and the light behind her. The road stretched endlessly before Emma, a winding ribbon of dirt and pebbles that seemed to lead nowhere. Her feet ached, her stomach growled, and the weight of her loneliness pressed upon her like a heavy cloak. She had walked for hours since leaving her family's farm, the last traces of sunset fading into a starless night. The air was cold now, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. The numbness in her heart was far deeper than any chill the wind could bring. She had no plan, no destination. All she knew was that she could not go back. Not to the city where she had struggled for so long, and certainly not to the family who had made it clear she was no longer one of them. So she walked, one step after another, until the darkness forced her to stop. A small thicket of trees offered meager shelter, and she curled up beneath their branches, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Sleep came in fits and starts, her dreams filled with the echoes of laughter, her family's laughter, sharp and mocking. When dawn finally broke, gray and misty, She forced herself to stand. Her body protested, stiff and sore, but she ignored it. Hunger gnawed at her insides, a relentless reminder of how little she had eaten the day before. She needed food. She needed work. Most of all, she needed a reason to keep going. The morning light revealed a small town in the distance, its rooftops peeking above the rolling hills. Emma hesitated. Towns meant people, and people meant judgment. But what choice did she have? She adjusted her dress, smoothed her hair as best she could, and walked toward the cluster of buildings, her heart pounding with every step. The town was already awake when she arrived, merchants setting up their stalls, children chasing each other through the streets, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery. Her stomach twisted painfully at the scent, but she had no coin to spare. Instead, she approached a woman sweeping the steps of a small inn. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know of any work here? I can clean, or sew, or—" The woman looked her up and down, her lips pursed. "No charity here, girl. Move along." Emma's cheeks burned, but she nodded and turned away. She tried again at the tailor's shop, then the apothecary, then the dairy. Each time, the answer was the same, sometimes polite, sometimes harsh, but always no. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and with it, her despair. Then, as she passed the bakery once more, a voice called out to her. "Wait there, child." An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her flour-dusted apron tied neatly over a well-worn dress. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and kind. Emma froze, unsure if she had heard correctly. The woman beckoned her closer. "You've been wandering this town all morning. Are you lost?" Emma swallowed hard.
No, ma'am.
"I'm looking for work." The woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Come inside." The bakery was warm, the heat from the ovens wrapping around Emma like an embrace. The scent of yeast and sugar filled the air, so rich it made her dizzy. The woman motioned for her to sit at a small table near the back, then placed a loaf of bread and a cup of milk in front of her. "Eat," she said. "Then we'll talk." Emma's hands shook as she reached for the bread. She wanted to devour it, to gulp it down like a starving animal, but she forced herself to take small, slow bites. The woman watched her, her expression unreadable. "I'm Mrs. Bennet," she said at last. "This is my bakery. And you are—" "Emma," she whispered. "Well, Emma," Mrs. Bennet said, folding her arms, "I don't give handouts. But if you're willing to work, I'll give you a place to sleep and fair wages. Can you knead dough? Tend a fire?" Emma nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do anything." Mrs. Bennet's lips twitched, almost a smile. "We'll see about that. Finish your meal, then wash up. You'll start today." And just like that, Emma had a chance. The work was hard, rising before dawn to stoke the ovens, kneading dough until her arms ached, scrubbing pans until her hands were raw. But it was honest. And for the first time in years, she felt useful. Days turned into weeks. Emma learned the rhythms of the bakery, the precise way to shape loaves, the exact moment to pull pastries from the oven. Mrs. Bennet was strict but fair, and though she rarely praised, the occasional nod of approval warmed Emma more than any words could. Then, one evening, as Emma swept the floor after closing, a man walked in. He was tall, his shoulders broad from labor, his hands calloused and strong. His clothes were simple but clean, his boots dusty from travel. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark, wind-tousled hair and warm brown eyes. "Sorry to come so late, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "I was hoping you still had some of those seed rolls left." Mrs. Bennet huffed. "You're lucky, Daniel." "Emma, fetch the rolls from the back." Emma hurried to obey, her pulse inexplicably quickening. When she returned, the man, Daniel, smiled at her. "You're new here." She nodded, suddenly shy.
Yes.
"I work for Mrs. Bennet now." He took the rolls with a grateful nod. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Emma." And as he left, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him, Emma realized something strange. For the first time in a very long time, she had been seen. The seasons turned like pages in a book, each one bringing its own rhythm to Emma's new life. Winter's bite gave way to spring's gentle warmth, and with it came a fragile sense of belonging. The bakery had become more than just a place of work. It was a refuge, a corner of the world where she could breathe without the weight of rejection pressing down on her. Mrs. Bennet, though never one for soft words, had begun to trust her with more than just chores. She taught Emma the secrets of the trade, how to tell when dough had proofed just right, how to sweeten apple tarts so they sang on the tongue, how to mend the frayed edges of a life with patience and flour-dusted hands. Daniel came by often, always near closing time, always with a quiet word or a story from his day's work. He was a carpenter, Emma learned, though he never boasted of it. He built shelves for the bakery's back room without being asked, his hands moving with steady precision. When he noticed the hem of Emma's dress was frayed beyond repair, he brought her a length of sturdy fabric the next day, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine.
"For someone who works as hard as you," was all he said.
Emma had never owned anything so fine. She saved every coin Mrs. Bennet paid her, tucking them into a small pouch hidden beneath her thin mattress. At night, she counted them by candlelight, dreaming of a place of her own, somewhere with a hearth that didn't belong to someone else, a door she could close against the world. The dream felt impossible, but she clung to it anyway, whispering prayers into the darkness. Then, one evening, old Mr. Higgins from the general store hobbled into the bakery, his cane tapping against the floorboards. "Heard you're looking for property," he said without preamble, fixing Emma with a roomy stare. Emma nearly dropped the tray of rolls she was holding. I am, sir. But I don't have much." "There's a place," he interrupted. "Old Miller's cottage, out by the West Fields. Roof's near gone, and the floors rotted through in spots. But the land's good, and the well's clean. Owner wants it off his hands." He named a price low, but still more than Emma had. Her heart sank. Daniel, who had been mending a stool in the corner, set down his tools. "I'll help," he said simply. Emma turned to him, stunned. "You don't even know what I can pay." "Doesn't matter." He wiped his hands on his apron. "I've got time, and I know my way around a hammer. We'll make it work." And so, with trembling hands, Emma handed over her savings to Mr. Higgins the next morning. The deed was signed, the land hers. The cottage itself was worse than she'd imagined, walls sagging, windows shattered, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. But Daniel just rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Days blurred together in a haze of sweat and sawdust. Emma learned to patch walls with daub and wattle, to lay floorboards straight and true. Daniel taught her how to shingle the roof without slipping, how to brace a beam so it wouldn't bow under weight. They worked from dawn till dusk, stopping only when the light faded completely. Some days, Mrs. Bennet sent over loaves of bread or jars of preserves. Other days, the townsfolk came by with offerings, a bucket of nails, a length of rope, a pot of stew to share. Emma hadn't realized how many people had been watching her, how many had quietly rooted for her all along. By the time the first frost kissed the ground, the cottage was whole again. The roof no longer leaked. The floors no longer creaked underfoot. The hearth, once choked with debris, now held a merry fire that warmed every corner of the small home. Emma stood in the center of it one evening, turning slowly, her eyes stinging. It wasn't grand. It wasn't much. But it was hers. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her. "You did it," he said softly. Emma shook her head. "We did it." He smiled then, the firelight catching the gold in his eyes. Word spread quickly about the cottage, as it always did in small towns. Emma expected curiosity, perhaps even admiration. What she didn't expect was the visitor who arrived one gray afternoon, just as she was scrubbing the soot from the hearthstones. A knock at the door. She opened it to find her father standing on the step, his hat in his hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes darted past her, taking in the sturdy walls, the clean floors, the fire crackling in the grate. His face, once so stern and unyielding, seemed to crumple in on itself. "Emma," he said hoarsely. Behind him, in the distance, she could see the rest of her family waiting by the road. Her mother, her siblings, their fine clothes now dull with dust. Their faces were pale, their expressions unreadable. Emma's fingers tightened on the doorframe. She could shut it. She could send them away. The thought flickered through her, hot and bright. But then she remembered the prayers whispered into the dark. The hands that had lifted her up when she had nothing. The second chance she'd been given. She stepped aside.
"Come in," she said.
"But know this. This house was built on hard work and faith. If you want to share in it, you'll need to learn both." And as her family crossed the threshold, their footsteps hesitant on the floor she had laid, Emma realized something. This wasn't just a house. It was a beginning. The winter winds howled around the little cottage like a living thing, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. Emma sat by the fire, her needle moving rhythmically through the fabric of a new dress, the first she had ever made for herself from cloth that wasn't patched or handed down. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the careful stitches that held her future together, one thread at a time. Her family had stayed for 3 days after their unexpected arrival, their initial awe at her home slowly giving way to uneasy silence. Her father had walked the perimeter of the property with his hands clasped behind his back, his boots sinking into the earth she now owned. Her mother had touched the edges of the shelves Daniel had built, her lips pressed into a thin line. They had eaten at her table, slept under her roof, and left without asking how she had survived all those years alone. But they had come. That, somehow, was enough. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She set aside her sewing and smoothed her skirts before opening it, expecting Mrs. Bennet with a basket of day-old bread or perhaps old Mr. Higgins with news of a new shipment of nails. Instead, Daniel stood on her step, snow dusting his shoulders and clinging to his dark hair. In his hands, he held a wooden box, its surface polished to a warm gleam. "Evening, Emma," he said, his breath curling in the cold air. "I finished it." She stepped back to let him in, brushing snowflakes from his coat as he passed. The box was small but sturdy, its corners joined with such precision that no nails were visible. When she lifted the lid, the scent of cedar rose to meet her. "For your sewing things," he said, running a hand along the edge. "I noticed you kept them in that old biscuit tin." Emma traced the delicate carvings along the sides, tiny vines and leaves, so finely detailed they seemed alive. Her throat tightened. "Daniel, this is too fine for—" "Nothing's too fine for you," he interrupted gently. Then, as if realizing what he'd said, he cleared his throat and turned toward the fire. "The cold settling in early this year. You've enough wood stacked." She nodded, watching the firelight play across his profile. In the months they'd spent rebuilding the cottage, she'd learned the language of his silences. The way he rubbed his thumb along his fingertips when he was thinking, the slight crease between his brows when he concentrated, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his late parents. But tonight, there was something new in his bearing, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Daniel," she began, but he turned suddenly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I've something to ask you," he said, his voice rough. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple wooden ring, its surface smooth from years of wear. "This was my mother's. She told my father to give it to her when he had nothing but his 2 hands and a heart full of love." He took a deep breath. "Emma, The words hung between them, fragile as the snow melting on the windowsill. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees. Inside, the fire crackled, sending sparks swirling upward. Emma reached out, her fingers brushing the ring. It was warm from his touch. "Yes," she whispered. Daniel's breath left him in a rush. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. It fit as if it had been made for her. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the future settling around them like the quiet hush of falling snow. Then Daniel smiled, a real, full smile that reached his eyes, and Emma knew, with sudden certainty, that she was home. The wedding was simple, held in the spring when the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth. Mrs. Bennet baked the cake, her gruff demeanor softening as she fussed over the icing. The townsfolk came, bringing gifts of knitted blankets and hand-carved spoons, their faces alight with genuine joy. Emma wore a dress the color of new cream, stitched by her own hands, the cedar box now holding her few treasures. Her family did not attend. But as Daniel took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin, Emma found she didn't mind. The past was behind her. Ahead lay a lifetime of mornings waking to the sound of his voice, of evenings spent by the fire, of prayers whispered together in the dark. And that, she thought as the sun streamed through the chapel windows, was more than enough. The golden light of late summer poured through the open window of the cottage, painting the wooden floor in warm stripes. Emma stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of honey-sweetened porridge, her movements slower now, more deliberate. The linen of her dress stretched taut over the gentle curve of her belly, a constant reminder of the miracle growing within her. She paused, one hand drifting to rest against the swell as she felt the familiar flutter beneath her palm, tiny feet dancing against her ribs, a secret language only she could understand. Daniel's boots scraped against the doorstep as he entered, his arms laden with fresh-cut timber. The scent of pine resin and summer sweat clung to him as he deposited the wood neatly by the fireplace. His eyes, always so warm when they rested upon her, darted immediately to her middle, as they had every day since the midwife had confirmed their hopes. "You should be sitting," he chided gently, crossing the room to press a work-roughened hand against her cheek. "Mrs. Bennet sent enough bread to last a week. There's no need for you to." A particularly strong kick interrupted him. Emma gasped, then laughed as Daniel's eyes widened in wonder. "He's impatient," she murmured, guiding his hand to where the movement was strongest. "Just like his father." Daniel's breath caught as he felt the life they created push back against his palm. In that moment, his face, so often stern with concentration, softened into something unbearably tender. "Samuel," he whispered, the name they'd chosen weeks ago slipping out unbidden. "Strong as the prophets." The months passed in a haze of preparation and quiet joy. Daniel built a cradle from the same oak he'd used for their marriage bed, carving vines and leaves along its edges to match Emma's sewing box. Emma stitched tiny gowns from the softest linen, her fingers trembling only slightly when she imagined the small body that would fill them. Even Mrs. Bennet, usually so reserved, could be caught humming as she packed baskets with ginger cakes and raspberry leaf tea, remedies, she claimed, for an easy birth. Then came the night when the first pain struck, sharp as lightning, stealing Emma's breath as she knelt by the herb garden. Daniel, who had been repairing the fence, dropped his hammer mid-swing and was at her side in 3 long strides. His hands, so steady when shaping wood, shook as he helped her inside. "Fetch the midwife," Emma managed between clenched teeth, gripping the edge of the table as another wave crested. Daniel hesitated, his face pale. "I can't leave you. Go." He went, running as though the devil himself were at his heels. The hours that followed blurred into a tapestry of pain and purpose. The midwife arrived with her bag of herbs and clean cloths, her calm voice guiding Emma through each contraction. Daniel, banished to the kitchen, paced like a caged wolf, jumping at every cry that escaped the bedroom. When dawn painted the sky in pale pinks and golds, a new sound joined the chorus of morning birds, a thin, indignant wail that sent Daniel crashing to his knees in relief. The midwife emerged, her tired face split by a grin. "Come meet your son," she said. Samuel was perfect. Tiny fists clenched in protest against a sudden cold, a thatch of dark hair plastered to his scalp, his face still flushed from the effort of birth. When Emma pressed her lips to his forehead, breathing in the scent of new life, something inside her shifted, an ancient, primal love that dwarfed every hardship she'd ever faced. Daniel hovered nearby, his big hands outstretched but uncertain, until Emma guided them into position. "Support his head," she murmured, transferring their son into his arms. The sight of her husband, this strong, quiet man who had built her a home and a future, cradling their child with tear-filled eyes, would stay with Emma forever. Samuel blinked up at his father, his tiny features screwing up in momentary confusion before settling into peaceful acceptance. Outside, the world continued on. Birds sang, the river rushed, the bakery ovens would soon warm for the day's bread. But inside the cottage, time seemed to pause, wrapping the three of them in a cocoon of quiet joy. Emma leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion and elation warring within her. Daniel's free hand found hers, their fingers intertwining above their son's downy head. No words were needed. The proof of their love, their little Samuel, slept peacefully between them, his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. And in that moment, Emma understood the true meaning of blessing. The first frost of winter had only just begun to silver the fields when the news reached Emma's cottage. A breathless boy from the village came pounding on her door just as the evening stew began to simmer, his cheeks flushed from running. "Your family's farm," he gasped, clutching his side. "There's been a fire." Emma's wooden spoon clattered against the hearthstones. Behind her, Daniel set down the axe he'd been mending, his face gone still. Little Samuel, now a sturdy toddler with his father's serious eyes, clung to her skirts, sensing the sudden tension in the air. "How bad?" Daniel asked, already reaching for his coat. The boy shook his head. "Barn's gone. Half the house with it. Your pa." He hesitated, glancing at Emma. He got the livestock out, but the smoke took his lungs something fierce. Emma moved, without thinking. She bundled Samuel into his warmest wraps, filled a sack with every healing herb and poultice she kept in her stores, and was lacing her boots before Daniel could speak again. "You don't owe them this," he said quietly, his hand on the doorframe. Emma paused, Samuel's weight solid in her arms. The memories rose unbidden. Her father's turned back at the reunion, her mother's cold silence, the years of being treated as less than nothing. But beneath the hurt, something deeper stirred. "I know," she said, "but Samuel deserves to know his grandparents. Even if only once." The journey to her childhood home was shorter than she remembered, the landmarks achingly familiar. The old oak, where she'd once scraped her knee climbing. The bend in the creek, where she'd caught tadpoles in summer. And then the farm, or what remained of it. The great barn was a blackened skeleton, its ribs jutting toward the twilight sky. The west wing of the house had collapsed inward, charred timbers jumbled like broken teeth. A cluster of neighbors worked in the yard, hauling water and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Her brother Thomas was the first to see her. He froze mid-step, a bucket dangling from his hand, his face streaked with soot and something like shame. "Emma?" The murmur spread through the gathered crowd like ripples in a pond. Heads turned, work stilled. And then, from the shadowed doorway of the still-standing kitchen, her mother emerged, older, frailer, her once proud shoulders slumped beneath a borrowed shawl. Their eyes met across the ruined yard. A lifetime of unspoken words hung between them. Emma took a deep breath and stepped forward. The next hours passed in a blur of purposeful motion. While Daniel joined the men assessing the structural damage, Emma set to work in the cramped sick room where her father lay wheezing. She brewed lungwort tea, applied mustard plasters to his chest, and instructed her sisters in changing the compresses. Her mother hovered nearby, silent until Emma reached for the last of her precious honey, the same golden harvest she'd been saving for Samuel's winter coughs. "You came," her mother whispered, watching Emma stir the honey into the bitter medicine. Emma didn't look up. "I did." Her mother's gnarled hand touched her wrist, featherlight. "We don't deserve your kindness." Outside, Samuel's laughter rang out as he chased Thomas's children around the undamaged apple tree. The sound was bright and clear against the somber backdrop of loss. Emma turned to face the woman who had once turned her away. "No," she agreed softly, "but grace isn't about deserving." The days that followed were a strange alchemy of sorrow and healing. Emma's father, though weak, began to breathe easier under her care. Her sisters, now married with children of their own, traded stories with her over the washtub as they scrubbed smoke from salvaged linens. Thomas and Daniel worked side by side in the frost-kissed mornings, raising temporary shelters for the remaining livestock. And her mother, proud, stubborn Martha, began leaving small gifts on Emma's makeshift bedroll. A tin of her favorite childhood sweets. A yellowed letter Emma had sent years ago, carefully preserved. The family Bible, open to the page where Emma's birth was recorded in faded ink. One evening, as Emma bundled Samuel into his wraps for the walk home, her father called her to his bedside. The firelight carved deep hollows in his face, but his eyes were clear for the first time in days. "You've built a good life," he rasped. Emma adjusted the blanket over his legs. "I had help." His gnarled hand covered hers. "I was wrong. About so many things." The words cost him. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the scorched earth with temporary purity. Emma thought of the cedar box Daniel had made her, of the way Samuel's small hand fit so perfectly in hers, of the love that had grown from the ashes of her loneliness. "I know," she said at last. And for the first time in years, she meant it. When the time came to leave, her family gathered in the yard to see them off. Thomas pressed a crate of salvaged heirloom seeds into Daniel's hands. Her sisters hugged her fiercely, promising to visit. Her mother, with trembling hands, tucked a carefully folded quilt around Samuel, the same pattern Emma had slept under as a child. The walk home was quiet, their breath puffing in the cold air. Samuel drowsed against Daniel's shoulder, his small fingers clutching the edge of the quilt. "Will you help them rebuild?" Daniel asked as their cottage came into view, smoke curling welcomingly from the chimney. Emma studied the familiar silhouette, the sturdy walls, the garden sleeping beneath the snow, the home they'd built together. Somewhere inside, Mrs. Bennet would be stoking the fire, ready with a scolding for their long absence and a fresh loaf for their supper. "Yes," she said, taking his arm, "but not at the cost of what we've made." And as they stepped over the threshold, Samuel stirring sleepily in Daniel's arms, Emma knew this was redemption. Not in grand gestures or dramatic forgiveness, but in the quiet choice to love without losing oneself. In the understanding that some bridges could be mended, even if others must remain broken. The fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. And for the first time in her life, Emma felt the past and present settle into peace. Years had a way of folding into one another like the pages of a well-loved book, each season blending into the next with quiet familiarity. Emma stood at the edge of her garden, her hands resting on the curve of her lower back as she surveyed the rows of vegetables stretching toward the morning sun. The ache in her joints spoke of decades of labor, of countless mornings spent tilling soil and pulling weeds, but the sight of the thriving plants, their leaves glistening with dew, filled her with a quiet satisfaction that outweighed any discomfort. Samuel, now a young man with his father's strong shoulders and his mother's thoughtful eyes, moved between the rows with practiced ease, checking the progress of the tomatoes. His wife, Ruth, knelt among the herb beds, her skilled fingers plucking sprigs of thyme and rosemary for the day's cooking. Their two children, dark-haired Miriam and curious little Josiah, darted between the rows like sparrows, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. The farm had grown over the years, its boundaries expanding with each passing season. What had once been a simple cottage now stood at the heart of a thriving homestead, a second house for Samuel's family, a proper barn for the livestock, even a small schoolhouse where Ruth taught the children of the village during the winter months. The land that had once been her desperate refuge had become a place of abundance, a testament to the grace that had carried her through the hardest years. A familiar weight settled on Emma's shoulders as Daniel stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. His beard was more silver than brown now, his hands rougher with age, but his embrace was as steady as it had been on their wedding day. "Thinking deep thoughts," he murmured against her ear. Emma leaned back into him, watching as Josiah tugged on Samuel's sleeve, demanding to be lifted onto his shoulders. "Just remembering," she said softly. The past was never far away. She could still recall the sting of rejection at that long-ago reunion, the gnawing hunger of her first nights in the town, the way the walls of her cottage had once seemed impossibly tall as she struggled to rebuild her life. But those memories no longer carried their old bitterness. Time and forgiveness had softened them, like stones worn smooth by a river's current. Her parents were gone now, her father passing peacefully in his sleep just a year after the fire, her mother following not long after. But the farm had endured. Thomas and his family still worked the land, though they no longer looked down on the dirt beneath their feet as they once had. The lessons of loss and humility had taken root, and the once divided family had slowly knit itself back together, stitch by careful stitch. A sudden commotion drew Emma's attention back to the present. Miriam was running toward her, her small hands cupped around something precious. "Grandmama, look," she cried, skidding to a stop. Carefully, she opened her fingers to reveal a fat, wriggling earthworm. "He's helping the garden," Emma laughed, brushing a stray curl from the child's forehead. "So he is. Just like you." Daniel squeezed her hand before moving off to help Samuel with the harvest baskets, his steps slower than they used to be, but no less sure. Emma watched him go, her heart full. This was the legacy they had built, not just the land or the buildings, but the love that had sustained them through every season. The faith that had carried them through drought and storm. The family that had grown from the ashes of loneliness. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lanterns were lit in the big farmhouse kitchen, the family gathered around the long wooden table. Bowls of steaming stew were passed from hand to hand, fresh bread piled high in the center. Samuel offered the blessing, his voice deep and sure, thanking God for the food, for the hands that had prepared it, for the love that bound them together. Emma looked around the table, at Daniel's weathered face, at Ruth's gentle smile, at the children's bright eyes, and felt the weight of all those years settle into something like peace. The road had been long, the journey harder than she could have imagined when she was that lonely girl standing on the outskirts of her family's reunion. But every step, every struggle, had led her here, to this table, to this family, to this grace. And as the voices of her grandchildren rose in laughter, mingling with the familiar creak of the old house settling around them, Emma closed her eyes and whispered her own quiet thanks for the harvest, for the home, and for the love that had made it all possible. The fire crackled in the hearth. The scent of bread and herbs filled the air. And outside, the first stars of evening began to shine over the fields, silent witnesses to a life well lived, a love well tended, and a story that would endure long after the final page was turned.